Under the high rafters of the county vehicle depot, sound traveled like weather rolling, pooling, coming back on itself. On that gray morning, it carried a line that should never have been said. "You're here to test the volume, sweetheart, not critique the system. Just stand there and tell us if it's loud." Carl Benton, tech supervisor, stood squarely beneath a stadium-sized siren horn and basked in the chuckles of a half-circle of deputies. His polo shirt clung to him like a flag at half-mast, and his grin said he'd found the morning's entertainment. A few deputies glanced down at their boots. Most didn't. Arrogance is infectious when it's confident and loud. The woman he addressed, Elaine Carter, didn't move, didn't color, didn't crack. She wore plain civilian clothes and the stillness of a statue, not defiance, not submission, just a steadiness that had no need to announce itself. She stood with her feet set and her hands easy at her sides, as if she were saving her strength for something that mattered. Across the concrete expanse, the county sheriff Whitaker, a man older than his badge and twice as hard, watched her with a narrowing eye. He wasn't looking at her face. He was measuring the posture that a lifetime gives a person and a lesser lifetime can't counterfeit. Benton pointed toward the microphone cradle on the rolling console. "This is the Sentinel public alert platform," he declared, proud of the way platforms sounded in his mouth. State-of-the-art voice-activated network integrated, tied into every first responder channel from here to the state line, designed for operators professionals who know how to command a scene. He let his gaze climb up and down Elaine's sleeves as though they were a clue to the joke. "It's not a toy. When I tell you to speak, you give us a simple testing 1, 2, 3. We need to calibrate for a civilian vocal range." "Understood." The last word snapped like a cheap switch. No one liked it, not really, but no one said so. Elaine's expression stayed level. She traced the line of the microphone cable with her eyes clocked the way it was looped, the strain relief, the connector at the base of the horn. She didn't need the primer. She'd seen systems like this in places where the air itself had a memory. Sheriff Whitaker eased off the fender of a patrol cruiser and took a few steps closer. He didn't interrupt. "Old lawmen know a foolish man will show himself if you give him enough rope and an audience." Benton, sensing total control, made a theatrical show of lifting the mic, pinching the talk switch, testing the gain with a small pop. He cleared his throat like a preacher, about to begin. "All right, sweetheart, let's hear it. Give us the test." The depot quieted in that strange way that happens before a punchline and after an insult. Elaine took the microphone, not like a person handed a tool for the first time, but like a professional, picking up the tool she always used, thumb on the seam. Fingers curled so the element wouldn't clip on plosive consonants. She took one measured breath and looked past the horn, past the cinderblock walls, through them, as if her voice had farther to travel than the depot's echo. She did not say testing. She did not count. Initialize protocol, sentinel, no boom, no feedback squeal. The horn gave a soft two-tone chime that cut clean through the depot's stale air like a scalpel. A hush arrived as if it had been waiting for its cue. Then a second voice issued from the horn, synthetic resonant, no trace of humanity except its purpose. Authentication confirmed. Voice print matched. "Welcome back, Sentinel Origin." No one laughed. Benton's smirk suctioned off his face as if someone had opened a pressure door. The console lights blinked and then steadied into a severity of red that had no business in a mere calibration. On the primary display, one line of text overrode the rest System Override Command Authority Engaged Classification Onyx. The deputies didn't speak because they didn't know how to speak to that. The loudest thing in the room was Whitaker's boots crossing the floor. He didn't look at Benton. He didn't glance at the screen. He stopped 3 feet from Elaine and held her eyes like a handshake. When he spoke, it was to her, but he let the whole room hear it. "Sentinel Origin," he said quietly. "My God, I haven't heard that designation since my boy was with the 75th. They called it a ghost." A few deputies shifted as if they'd been caught in church not paying attention. The sheriff turned just enough that his words would carry. "You thought you were having her test a speaker," he said to the room, still not rewarding Benton with direct eye contact. "You weren't. The system was testing for her. That wasn't a test phrase. It was a key, the master key, built into the core architecture by the original designer." He faced Elaine again, all the old iron of his bearing reshaped into something like reverence. That voice print doesn't just activate the system, he said. It is the system. Sentinel Origin isn't a call sign. It's the designation for the Tier 1 operator who designed the voice command backbone for Joint Ops and the one who first deployed it under fire. He didn't ask her to confirm it because some truths don't need witnesses. Instead, Sheriff Whitaker did something he'd done in full dress for a president and maybe twice for a governor. He brought his heels together, squared his shoulders, and delivered a slow, formal salute to a woman in plain clothes holding a county microphone. "Ma'am," he said, and let the word land. "It's an honor to have you in my county." Whatever scaffolding Benton had been standing on in his mind, it gave way right then. The deputies felt it too, not schadenfreude, not triumph, but the jolt that comes when a thing you were sure about turns into a thing you should have been sure about all along. They weren't looking at a consultant anymore. They were standing in front of the architect. Benton tried for a laugh and found he didn't have one. His hand hovered uselessly above the console like he could turn off the last 15 seconds. Reaper, he sputtered, plucking the wrong legend from some internet memory, and then he saw the letters on the screen and corrected himself in a whisper. Sentinel Origin. He swallowed. Classification, Onyx. That's above our pay grade. Whitaker finished not unkindly because humiliation is punishment enough when it's this public. And above yours, Mr. Benton. Elaine set the microphone in its cradle and stepped back, not retreating, just making space for oxygen to return. There was no triumph on her face, no taught lesson stamped across her mouth. If anything, she looked relieved. The system still did what it had been designed to do when asked in the right language by one of the few people meant to ask it. A deputy near the back whispered, "Holy," and clamped his teeth shut. The word died in the air, like a moth in a flame. "Let's breathe," Whitaker set his voice back to its usual gravel. "And let's learn." He walked to the console and tapped the screen once to bring up the log that only 12 people in the country were supposed to know existed. Authentication traces challenge response hashes, a time-stamped match to an originating voice print that had been seeded into the network a lifetime ago and refreshed in the dark for missions nobody here would ever read about. He didn't narrate it line by line. He simply let the data glow where everyone could see it. "It's not magic," he said. "It's memory, and it's math, and it's scars, baked into silicon by people who understand what happens when the radio dies and the world goes sideways." He looked at Benton finally, not to finish breaking him, but to hand him something worth picking up. "Mr. Benton," he said, "this is where you stop talking and start listening." Benton nodded barely, like a man nodding to a sentence he doesn't deserve and intends to serve anyway. The deputies' faces were all the same now. Attention without defensiveness, a lane wide open for information to travel. Whitaker turned back to Elaine. "Ma'am," he said, less ceremony now, more practical. "Our people need to understand what this means on the ground. We don't need secrets. We need principles." "What do you want them to carry out of this room?" Elaine considered him for a full breath. The depot hummed vents, distant compressors, the animal noise of a building alive. She could have given them jargon and watched it blow past them like dry grass. She could have given them biography and watched them turn it into a campfire story. Instead, she handed them a sentence simple enough to write on a card and hard enough to live by. "Listen for the signal," she said, "not the noise." Whitaker nodded once like a man who knew exactly what he'd been handed. He turned to the deputies. "You heard the lady." The shock wore off the room in layers like thaw. People began to move to work to reset the console and document what had happened. Benton took a step nearer and then another, as if getting closer to the system would get him closer to understanding it. He didn't reach for the mic. Nobody did. The thing had become in 2 minutes a relic. They ran the test again in a plain way with plain words. Everything behaved. The Sentinel network logged its standard green checkmarks and settled to idle waiting for a world that might need it before sunset or never again. The deputies filtered out to calls and training and the 1,000 quiet tasks that keep a county from catching fire. By nightfall, the story had traveled farther than a patrol car can drive in a shift. Not gossip, a lesson. The next morning, it had a title in the code a radio operator uses when he wants everyone to picture the same thing the day Benton met the architect. It didn't change the county overnight. It changed the room where decisions get made about who talks and who listens. It changed the way a rookie deputy adjusted the angle of his questions when an older woman answered slower than he liked. It changed the grip a dispatcher used on her own headset, like the weight of the moment might teach the weight of the tool. Benton thought he might outrun it by working. He cataloged the racks. He traced every wire in the closet himself, checked every firmware version, read every page of every manual, including the ones that never make it to public release. He stayed late, as if penance burns faster in fluorescent light. He stopped calling anyone sweetheart. A week later, he went looking for Elaine before she disappeared back into the part of the world you can't track on a map. He found her at the edge of the depot with her hands in a cable case, doing what she'd done since she arrived, making sure the thing that matters works. "Ma'am," he said, and then stalled because the word sorry is small and the bridge it must cross is wide. There's no excuse for the way I talked to you. I was unprofessional. I was wrong." Elaine straightened and met his eyes. No rescues, no scold. She had the expression of a person who knows adults must carry the knowledge of who they've been and who they're trying to be, and that no one can carry it for them. "The system works, Mr. Benton," she said. "That's what matters." He nodded, because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't unbalance the perfect weight of it. She closed the case and left the way she'd come in, without fanfare, without explanation, like competence walking off stage to its next job. Sheriff Whitaker stood in the dispatch center later that afternoon and watched a young tech pin a small laminated card above the primary console. It wasn't a flowchart. It wasn't a password. It was the sentence the county had just been given to live by. "Remember to listen for the signal, not the noise. Sentinel origin." The card stayed. It survived coffee splashes and new paint, and the 1,000 small changes a building accumulates. When tourists from the state came through with clipboards and eyes for photographs, no one mentioned it. When Benton trained a new hire, he tapped the card first. Their culture moved by an inch in a direction that mattered. The story did what stories do when they're true and sharpened to a point. It grew into other rooms. The dispatchers told it to new operators in the hushed minutes before midnight, when the phones can go from silence to ruin in a single ring. Patrol told it to the academy kids in the gravel lot behind the range with more sweat than poetry. The county IT office told a version with fewer salutes and more acronyms. In each retelling, the core didn't change. A quiet person walked in, did the work without boasting, and left a standard behind. People asked the sheriff if he'd known who Elaine Carter was the moment he saw her. "No," he said. "I knew what she was." "What's that?" "The kind of person you salute before you know where she served." Benton changed in ways that didn't make a show of themselves. He was still exacting with the techs, still the first to point out a mislabeled cable or a lazy patch panel. But the edge came off. He didn't perform. He coached. When someone asked for the story, he told it clean and short, with himself as the fool and not the victim. "I thought I was in charge of a horn," he'd say. "Turns out I was standing in front of a keyhole." He kept a copy of the Sentinel manual at his station and never referenced it in arguments, only in repairs. When a deputy cracked a joke about volume testing, Benton smiled and handed him the same lesson he'd been given any time he saw a chance to pass it on. Listen for the signal, he'd say, and point toward the card. Months passed. The department didn't turn into a monastery. It turned into a place where a rookie's idea could live long enough for a sergeant to hear it, where a dispatcher's quiet warning could carry the same weight as a shouted order if the warning wore the right evidence, where a person with no badge could be the one right voice in a room full of rank. They named the microphone without a formal vote, the Origin mic. People handled it with the same care they gave a folded flag. Not superstition, respect for an object that had once been ordinary until a moment made it more. If someone dropped it, the room stopped. If someone cleaned it, they warned the others first, like they were about to touch a page in a family Bible. New deputies asked who Elaine Carter had been. The old hands corrected the grammar. Who she is, they'd say. She's the reason you speak clearly into the radio and the reason you never assume you're the smartest voice on the channel. Sheriff Whitaker kept his changes small and relentless. He made sure the roll call briefings ended with questions. He made sure every hot call debrief included a line item. What signal did we ignore because the noise was loud? He told his lieutenants to lead like radios, transmit less, receive more. He said it until they said it without him. On the 1-year mark, the county didn't hold a ceremony. They changed the batteries in the handhelds. They replaced the shock mounts under the siren horn. Benton printed a fresh copy of the laminated card and retired the old one to a drawer like a flag that had done its time in the weather. He didn't throw it away. Some paper you don't. Whitaker found himself at the center console late one night with the dispatchers watching a summer thunderstorm roll across the map in green and yellow smears. He thought of his boy, years gone, from the regiment kids of his own now, and of the way time works on both people and departments. He thought of Elaine stepping into a room and teaching it the difference between authority and competence in less than a minute. Funny thing, he said to no one in particular. The loudest voice I've heard this year didn't need to raise itself at all. The dispatcher on duty 50-ish with shoulders like a barn beam smiled without looking away from her screens. Good voices, don't she said. The call came in for a multi-car pileup on the 2-lane by the river, and conversation stopped. People moved, and for a while, everything that mattered was hot mics and road grit and blood. When the dust settled, the debrief circled back to the card above the console. What signal did we hear? Whitaker asked. The quiet one, the dispatcher said, the kid in the back seat whispering. We nearly missed him under the sirens and yelling. She tapped the card. We didn't miss him. Elaine's name wasn't on any plaque. She would have hated it there. Her legacy lived in a county that learned to hear the whisper inside, the shout, and act on it. In a supervisor who taught without swagger because he knew what swagger had almost cost him. In a sheriff whose salute meant more in a garage than it ever had on a dais. The story never calcified into myth. It stayed flexible like a muscle that keeps being used. A new hire would hear it and ask if it really happened like that, and someone who'd been there would nod and add a small detail, the sound of the chime, the way the room felt taller for a second, the look on Benton's face when the words Sentinel Origin came through the horn. Sometimes Whitaker would be asked, "You think she'll come back?" Folks like that, he'd say, are always back. You just don't recognize them until you need to. And that was the point. Not to wait for heroes, but to become a place where heroism has a place to land quietly, efficiently, without needing a microphone at all. If you were to stand in that depot today and look up, you'd see the siren horn, clean and dust-free, and the origin mic, resting in its cradle like a sleeping instrument. You'd see above the main screen a fresh laminated card with a line that has aged better than any device in the building. Remember to listen for the signal, not the noise. There's a lesson there that doesn't care whether you wear a badge or a suit, whether you're 20 or 72. In the cockpit and in the living room, at a command console or a kitchen table, the principle holds noise is easy to make. Signal is hard to earn. The people who change outcomes are almost never the ones shouting. They're the ones paying attention when attention is work. Elaine Carter didn't leave a speech. She left a standard. She didn't hand the county a monument. She handed it a habit. All these months later, that habit is still doing the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping strangers alive. If that resonates with you, if you've seen a moment when quiet mastery outperformed loud certainty, tell it in the comments. Share the signal you heard when everyone else was listening to the noise. And if you want more true, hard-won stories where humility and competence do exactly what they're built to do, subscribe and come back. We'll keep the mic ready, but we won't shout into it. We'll let the work speak like Elaine did so the room can go quiet for the right reasons and stay that way long enough to hear what matters next.